Okay, welcome back everybody to the live webinar here at Bina. So we're going to do today, we're in the middle of our series of the 13 principles of faith, going through the 13 fundamental principles of what it means to be a believing Jew as set out by the Rambam, Maimonides. And we've been going through principle number 8 for the past few weeks, various aspects, various details, because perhaps everything else is really based on principle number 8, because principle number 8 is to believe in the divinity of the Torah, the fact that the Torah comes from God and is not man-made. What I wanted to do today is summarize, but also go through one more detail which we haven't touched, and then everything will sort of put it all together, and then on Thursday we'll move on to principle number 9. So, just to summarize everything we've said till now. So, when we say that the Torah is divine, number one, we mean the written Torah. The written Torah being the 5 books of what's called the 5 books of Moses, Chamisha Chumshei Torah. That includes Chumash Devarim, which even though it says that Moshe Rabbeinu said it on his own accord, so to speak, it was his own speech, nevertheless, every single word of those 5 books are dictated word for word by God himself to Moshe Rabbeinu, and of course the rest of Nach, the rest of the prophets and the writings, Ksuvim, are obviously all divine, all from God. However, this also includes, as we've discussed, Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law. And we've divided the oral law into 2 parts. The oral law, and we're going to add some more parts today, but so far we've divided it into 2 parts. The oral law, Torah Sheba'al Peh, includes what we call halacha l'Moshe Sinai, tradition, things that were told to Moshe Rabbeinu by God on Mount Sinai. For example, the fact that tefillin's black, or the tefillin that's made out of parchment. All these things are not written in the Torah, they cannot be interpreted from the Torah. Nevertheless, they were given by God to Moshe Rabbeinu. And as the Rambam points out, there are very little, or in fact no disputes about tradition. No one holds that tefillin should be purple. Everyone holds that tefillin needs to be black because it was passed down by tradition. It was never subject to discussion. It was never subject to dispute. It's as godly as the actual mitzvah of tefillin. Just like the mitzvah of tefillin, which is written clearly in the Torah, is from God, so to the fact that tefillin needs to be black was straight from God. The difference is Moshe Rabbeinu didn't write it down. It was transmitted orally. Another whole section of Torah Sheba'al Peh, maybe perhaps most of it, is discussion, is debate, and that is how to interpret the Torah. Because many laws were not handed down by tradition, were not clearly dictated by God. The general law was, the general mitzvah was, but much was left up to the sages to interpret the Torah. So the fact that we know that there's an obligation to eat in the sukkah on the first night of sukkah. So the fact that, this is just an example, the fact that we have to sit in the sukkah is clearly in the Torah. But maybe we can eat things that don't need to be eaten in the sukkah. So technically you can go by the whole sukkah without eating in the sukkah. If you just eat vegetables, for example, you're not obligated to eat it in the sukkah. Nevertheless, we know that there's actually an obligation, a biblical obligation on the first night of Sukkot to eat bread in the sukkah. How do we know that? It's not clearly written in the Torah. Well, it's derived by the sages. We know just like matzah is an obligation on the first night, so too the first night of Sukkot is an obligation to eat in the sukkah. And they use a principle called Gzeira Shava, which means you take a word here and a word there, and since it uses the same word, so you know the same laws apply. Where do they get this system from? The system is God-given. God gave Moshe Rabbeinu a system of how to interpret the Torah on Mount Sinai, and therefore when the sages use that system, their conclusion is as divine as the mitzvah itself, because that is the way God wanted them to interpret the Torah. Now, how do we know what the law is? Because when you leave it up to interpretation, there's going to be disputes. As we discussed, the Torah itself says, Achrei Rabim Lahatos, that we need to follow the majority. So when there's a dispute, we go after the majority, and then that conclusion, that final conclusion of what the halacha is also divine because God says, follow the majority. This is everything we've been discussing the past few weeks. What I wanted to discuss today is to perhaps go a little bit deeper and take this a step further. It's not only that the conclusion, the final halacha is divine, and it's not only the system that they use to get to their conclusion, the sages of the Talmud, of the Mishnah, which we are primarily talking about, is divine. It's even more than that. The individual opinions of each one of the sages, even those that the law is not like, is divine as well. As the Talmud says, it says, Eilu va'eilu divrei Elokim chayim. These and these are the words of the living God. You have Beis Shammai, the school of Shammai. You have Beis Hillel, the school of Hillel. One says it's forbidden, one says it's permitted. The Talmud says, Eilu va'eilu divrei Elokim chayim. Both of these schools of thought are the words of the living God. What does that mean? How can God say two opposite things? So, there's a Rashi in Tractate Subis that says the following. And I'm quoting word for word here. I'm going to translate in English. When two sages argue in civil or religious law, each offering his own rationale, then there is no falsehood here. Each one is offering his own valid reasoning. One endorses, the other prohibits. One proposes a certain legal precedent, and the other a different precedent. But we can still say both are the words of the living God, Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chayim, because under some circumstances, the logic of one sage will be appropriate, whereas under slightly different circumstances, the other sage's words will be appropriate. This seems to me more like a rational explanation, how we can say that they're both correct. Because just like any logic, when you have a dispute, the logic could be true if you just shift the circumstance a little bit. So if Beis Shammai says one thing and Beis Hillel says another thing, no one is saying a false thing. It just depends in which circumstance you're talking about. Shift slightly the circumstance and the other one will be correct. Perhaps on a less rational level, but more on a belief level, the Ritva, another one of the commentaries on the Talmud, says the following, a fascinating thing. He says, he quotes the phrase, Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chayim, both are the words of the living God. And he says like this, the French rabbis of blessed memory asked, how is it possible that both positions could be the words of the living God when one prohibits and the other permits? V'tirtzu, he says, they answered, Ki kisha'Allah Moshe lamorim, when Moshe ascended on high, lekabil Torah, to accept upon the Torah, Heruloi, they showed him al kol davar v'davar, on every single matter of the Torah. Mem tes panim, 49 arguments l'isur, to prohibit. Umem tes panim leheter, and 49 arguments to permit. Meaning to say, when Moshe Rabbeinu went up on Har Sinai, he heard 49, on every single law, he heard 49 arguments one way and 49 arguments another way. Moshe Rabbeinu asked God, and in other words, he asked God, like, what am I supposed to do? I have 49 ways of thinking and 49 ways of thinking. So he said, I'm giving this over to the hands of the sages, and the ruling will be as they decide. What does that mean? You see two things here. First of all, you see the more basic point that the final conclusion in Jewish law was handed to the sages. God himself sanctions the conclusion of the sages, and he says, this is what I want. But you see something else here. When they taught the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu, God taught him all the opinions. Meaning all the opinions of the sages all exist within God's wisdom, so to speak. What is Torah? Torah is God's wisdom. It's God's way of understanding. When we have a halachic question, a halachic debate in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, and there's one logic that tells us to prohibit, another logic that tells us to permit, God thought up both of them. Both of them exist within God's brain, so to speak, within God's wisdom. And therefore they're equally as godly. Eilu va'eilu divrei Elokim chayim, both are the words of the living God. Perhaps this can be explained a little bit more according to what it explains in Kabbalah. This whole idea in a more Kabbalistic way. We know that God is infinite and God is undefined. However, God then manifests himself in the higher spiritual worlds in what we call in Kabbalah the 10 sfirot, the 10 attributes. Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, various forms of of divine energy, of divine revelation. God can reveal himself in a way of kindness. He can reveal himself in a way of discipline, of gevura, of more harshness, of tzimtzum, of holding himself back. And both are godly. Both are ways, both chesed and gevura, both kindness and severity or discipline, are two ways of God being revealed. God can be revealed in both of them, and God expresses himself and is manifested in both of these ways. And it explains in Kabbalah that when Beis Shammai, the school of Shammai, which is the classic example of dispute, is Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And Beis Shammai was usually more to the stricter side, Beis Hillel was more to the lenient side. And we are told that the reason for that is because the source of the souls of Beis Shammai was gevura, was more strictness, with the way the divine energy is manifested in gevura. And in Hillel, Beis Hillel, the school of Hillel, their souls were sourced in chesed. Therefore, they went more to the lenient side. Both chesed and gevura are both equal ways of divine manifestation. None are less, in the higher spiritual world, none are less divine. And therefore, so too their opinions are equally as divine. Which is, now, why is the law like one of them? Usually the law follows Beis Hillel. Because today, we are not really able to handle the revelation, so to speak, of gevura, of God's judgment, or sort of harshness or strictness. It's too much for us. And therefore the law followed Beis Hillel. But it says that when Mashiach will come, the law will go like Beis Shammai, because it will be on such a high level that we'll be able to be more strict, we'll be able to go to the stricter side. There's a fascinating Ran, another one of the commentaries, early commentaries on the Talmud, that I want to read to you. I want to read to you a Ran and then a Ramban, Nachmanides, which tells us the power of the sages, of the Chachamim, and that their conclusions, what they come to, is godly and divine. Says the Ran, since God has handed the decision-making power over to the sages, it follows that whatever they decide represents God's command in that particular area. And it is on this basis that we are confident that in following the laws of the Torah, we are observing God's will, so long as we rely on what the leading sages of the generations have decided. The Ramban says like this, he quotes a pasuk from last week's parsha. You must not deviate from the words that the sages will tell you right or left. And Rashi says, "Afilu im oimer lecha al yamin shul smoil or al smoil shul yamin," which means even if they tell you that right is left or that left is right, you have to listen to them. It's an expression. Even if they tell you something that looks to you ridiculous, you need to listen to them. Ki ala das shalohem unasel ematorah. That is because it was subject to the judgment of the sages that God gave the Torah. Afilu yeh be'einecha k'machlif hayomim b'smoil, even if it appears to you that they have exchanged right for left, for God does not abandon his pious ones, always ensuring them they are saved from error. This is fundamental. This is fundamental because we need to understand that the divinity of the Torah, and this is what we're trying to sort of hammer home here in principle number 8. Principle number 8, the divinity of the Torah is not only the written Torah. Every single passage of the Talmud, every ruling of the sages of the Gemara, and really the leading sages of every generation, is divine. It's given from God. It's not people which had their own agendas. It's not people which based their rulings on the current trends of society of the time. Rather, we're talking about people which had the divine authority to paskin, to rule halacha. This is fundamental. This is one of the fundamentals of our faith. And I'll read to you two more things from the Medrash and from Tosfos, one of the commentaries on the Gemara. The Medrash says, "Lo yoymar adam," a person should not say, "Eini mekayim mitzvahs keinim," I am not going to observe the commands of the sages. Hoil ve'eino min haTorah. It's not biblical. It's not required by the Torah. Omer lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God tells them, "Bonai, my child, einatem rashoyim loymar kach." You're not allowed to say that. Elakol masha goyzrim aleichem tiyu mekayim. Whatever they decree, listen. And he quotes the verse, "Lama," why? Af al divreim ani maskin, because I too agree with their words. A medrash, a clear medrash. And then we have the famous line that Tosfos says, "Uminag aviseinu toirahi." a custom of our fathers is Torah. And this leads into the final point that I want to say. Everything we've been talking about till now is all law. Whether biblical law or rabbinic law, it's all divine. That's obvious. That's part of principle number 8. All the commentaries explain. The Rambam himself says in principle number 8, it includes Torah Shebaal Peh, it includes the oral law. And as we see in all of these sources, that Torah Shebaal Peh is divine and God gave the authority to the sages, etc., etc. How about custom? How about tradition? How about things that this is just the way it's been done for generations, sanctioned by the leaders of every generation, sanctioned by customs of the Jewish people? Says Tosfos, Uminag aviseinu Toirahui. A custom of our fathers is Torah. We should never say, oh, it's just a custom. Apple dipped in honey, okay, just a custom, not so important. No, it's very important. It's what God wants. It's Torah. It's part of the divine Torah given to us at Mount Sinai by God. Everything that is in Torah is Torah. Everything that is in Torah is divine. Now, of course, there are levels. There's biblical law, there's rabbinic law, there's custom. But the levels are just about how strict we need to be when observing them. There are various leniencies when it comes to rabbinic law. There are various leniencies, of course, when it comes to a custom. But in terms of the divinity, in terms of the godliness, in terms of, is this God's will? It's all God's will. The entire Torah is God's will. And that's what we need to believe in, and that is principle number 8 of the 13 principles of faith. What we're going to do on Thursday is go on to principle number 9, which is obviously based on principle number 8, the idea of the eternity of the Torah. That the Torah can never change. Obviously, we need to first acknowledge principle number 8, that it's divine, in order to understand that Torah cannot change, as we will see on Thursday.